today is I really want to tell you a little bit of a story. And this is a story about a few little birds that actually changed my life. Now when I say that, what do I exactly mean? Changed my life? Well, what I mean by that is that they made me think differently. They changed my perspective. They taught me some things, and they actually opened up a whole new area of research that I would have never even thought of doing. Unlike Matt and Danny, I have absolutely no educational background in ornithology or wildlife management or any of this. So, but that doesn't mean you can't do research. I mean, basically one learns to do research and then you apply it to different systems. So this was kind of a fun new segue for me. So let me kind of get into this a little bit here. Let me figure out how to get my slides to go forward. Hang on, there we go. Now, just want to mention that, I do a lot of different types of research. If you want to learn more about some of my research, you can go to YouTube and just type in Brennan Organic, and there's a few different videos there. But what I'm really going to focus on today is what I call undercover work. Okay, so I'm an undercover government agent. I work under cover crops. I spend a lot of time on my butt and on my knees, bending down and looking under cover crops, sitting there for hours and hours and hours and trying to untangle the complexity that's there and understand what's happening. Now, if you don't know, cover crops are crops that we don't harvest. They're things that we plow back in usually, and they provide all kinds of benefits from nutrient management to increasing the diversification in our systems. But what's really cool about cover crops is there's all kinds of neat things happening underneath there. So I grew up in the tropics in Papua New Guinea. And when I get under a cover crop, I sort of feel like a mini, like a little person again. And it's almost like I'm in a forest. You can see things like, these lady beetles down there. They're often pretty large numbers in looking for aphids to eat. And here's even a shot of a parasitoid wasp that's actually stinging an aphid, laying an egg inside of it. One thing I find when I'm in those cover crops is I'm glad I'm not an aphid because there's a lot of critters after you. But what I also find myself sometimes doing is being glad that I didn't sit on things or step on things in the cover crop. For example, this bunch of eggs from a duck that I almost stepped on once that just about gave me a heart attack when it flew out. And snakes and things like this. So there's unknowns under there, and then there's things that I'm sort of expecting. Now, today's story really focuses on bird droppings because that's what kind of got my attention. So I've been doing cover crop research in Salinas for about a year or so. This is back a picture from 2002. And I noticed under certain cover crops, there were more bird droppings. And I thought, why is that? Well, I kind of put that aside because we didn't really have a very good experiment to study this in, but then we started a long-term study, which is now in about its 18th year. And during 2 years of this study, I decided to look into this bird dropping issue. So this is our long-term study. And we've got different cover crops in our study. We've got mustard here. It's the same mustard species that you use for, on your sandwiches, a legume rye mixture, and then rye. Okay, so those are grown in our long-term rotation. We also have some fallow or some plots that are frequently fallow, but they're grown during the winter time, and then we go into vegetables the other times of the year. Now you can read all the gory details about this in this paper if you want that came out in Frontiers and Sustainable Food Systems. But what I want to do is just kind of give you a little bit of a taste of some of the data and not get too far into the weeds on this because there's a lot of details there, but I think there's some other stories behind it that may be just as interesting. So here's the stars of the show: white-crowned sparrow, the song sparrow, and the Savannah sparrow. I have to admit, when I started studying birds, I could barely differentiate these three birds. I mean, now they look pretty different, but when one isn't paying attention to little birds, little brown birds like this, you just kind of think they're all the same. And keep in mind, I grew up in the country of the bird of paradise. birds in Papua New Guinea are colorful, incredibly colorful. It took me a while to appreciate the beauty of the birds in North America, but I now do. So these are the stars of the show. And essentially what I did was when we were harvesting our cover crops, I would collect from the area where I was harvesting biomass of the cover crop for other purposes. I would collect bird droppings. Okay, just pick them up and count them, oven dry them and weigh them. So, and here's what I found. Very, very clear data. This is the average number of bird droppings per square meter under a legume rye mixture, mustard and rye. And there's about 10 times more droppings under mustard. Made me wonder why, what's going on under mustard? Well, to try to understand that, I take those droppings, use a high-tech method of putting them in water, dissolve the droppings, and then I really enjoy plant anatomy. So I stick them under my microscope and I look to see what is inside that dropping. And you can see all kinds of interesting things. There's a lot of plant tissue in some of them, and then there's also some insect tissue. So plant and insect tissue were the predominant tissues that we found. But we can use that information to try to understand which birds the droppings came from and then why they might be eating those things. So let me tell you just a little bit about the birds. It's quite hard to differentiate. I don't think actually we could not differentiate between droppings that came from a song sparrow or a savanna sparrow because they both eat pretty similar things: arthropods, insects, spiders, whatever, and seeds. But what's cool is that the white-crowned sparrow also eat leaves. And this is cool because its droppings are pretty unique. It's also one of the reasons that it's one of the more challenging birds here because it can eat some of our vegetables. So in a nutshell, what we found was that the white-crowned sparrow, the majority of those droppings in mustard came from the white-crowned sparrow versus the droppings that were in rye and the legume rye were usually insect or seed-dominated droppings. Seldom did we find a vegetation-dominated dropping in rye or legume rye. And that begs the question, why? What is it about mustard that attracts the white-crowned sparrow? Well, here's the hypothesis that I wrote into this paper. The white-crowned sparrow is known to have a high need for sulfur amino acids for its feather production. And these are things like methionine. It's an essential amino acid for us as well. It's a precursor to glucosinolates, which is what gives mustards and broccolis their spicy flavor. But we think that the white-crowned sparrow is actually eating those to try to meet that need for the sulfur-rich amino acids. Now, one thing I should just mention real quickly is the white-crowned sparrow that I'm talking about is not here year-round. It's a complicated bird species. There's, I think, 4 or 5 subspecies. The one that we're dealing with here is Gamble's white-crowned sparrow, which is a long migrant. There's actually a paper that came out recently from some interesting folks that tracks the movement of these. They go like 3,500 miles all the way up to the Arctic. Anyway, you might want to check that one out, but there's also a nice write-up on some of the different sparrows in this area. But what I kind of want to spend just a little bit of time now talking about is how farmers can use this information and hopefully use it to make it so that the white-crowned sparrow is not a challenge. So when you look in this field here, this is a broccoli field right next to our organic research field is where this hedgerow begins. So everything this direction is the organic research field. This is my conventional neighbor. You can notice there's a lot of defoliation there. That was one year when my neighbor had terrible challenges with the white-crowned sparrow. And here's what I think the reason that happened was because that was the one year when he was growing broccoli, and I didn't have a fallow field, but I did not have mustard across the fence. So this is sort of a scenario here. So let's assume my neighbor's growing broccoli. I think one way we could potentially help to minimize the damage from the white-crowned sparrow is to make sure I've got a mustard cover crop across the hedgerow that may kind of act as a trap crop to keep it happy, keep it well fed. I think that would be far less likely to have damage in the broccoli here than if I had, say, a fallow field right next to it. Another idea would be maybe you don't need a full field of mustard. Maybe you could have just strips of mustard in other cover crops or some other crop that was not susceptible to damage by the white-crowned sparrow. So basically trying to draw the birds out of the hedgerow into this other field, maybe with a little bit less mustard. And then here's another thought also would be, if you're growing strawberries next to a field where there's potential for damage from the white-crowned sparrow due to this hedgerow or some kind of natural habitat nearby, rather than having the furrows of your strawberry fields bare, put mustard in the furrows. So this is a practice that I've been pushing a lot here because it reduces runoff and provides a lot of other benefits. But what's also cool is that the white-crowned sparrows can then use that habitat, that food source, and it might keep them out of your neighbor's fields. Anyway, that's kind of all I wanted to cover in terms of the content. So I think I got about 8 minutes or so here. If you have any questions or whatever, go for it.
All right. Well, I don't see, and if you have a question, just again, put it in the chat box on the bottom and I can ask that if you have any questions. But I don't see any in there at this moment.
No problem. Well, maybe while somebody's thinking whether or not they want to add one in there, let me show you one more interesting thing that I did not include actually in that time there. 2 days ago when I was out checking our strawberry fields, where we actually, by the way, we always do grow mustard in the furrows. I was really happy to see, and I've seen this a few times, weeds that grow right next to the strawberry plant are often specifically taken out by the white-crowned sparrow. So the white-crowned sparrow in this case is actually coming in and it's eating all the foliage, not of the strawberries, but of specific weeds that it likes to eat. And therefore we don't have to come in and pull that out. So that's a really good example of the mustard drawing the bird into that strawberry field to definitely provide us with a gift like Matt was mentioning, or an ecosystem service.
Okay, Eric, we have some questions.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the first is, does the mustard furrow crop, cover crop, bring more potential damage to strawberries?
No, that's the cool thing about the system is, so if we go back here to this, to look at that picture there, when we've got mustard in the strawberries are not actually producing fruit yet. So we actually come in, and right now we come in and we actually are starting to cut back the mustard, but the strawberries still will not be in production for another month or so. And so this issue of droppings from the white-crowned sparrow being an issue on the bed top and on those strawberries is not really a problem because it's a timing issue. The timing is kind of, we can manage the mustard, take it down when we need to keep the birds from being a problem when we're actually producing berries. So we've done this since 2011. And as far as we can tell, it doesn't increase bird damage on the berries at all. Great question.
Great. Here's another one. Are the sparrows particularly attracted to seedlings, or do they eat the foliage of the more mature mustard?
That's a good question that I don't completely know the answer to. I have seen with this mustard species, they definitely will eat it when it's smaller, when it's big. But I don't think that's quite the case with other brassicas like broccoli. They seem to be really bad when they're young, when the plants are really small. You know, so it's still a bit of an open question, but I don't think it's as bad once the plants are bigger. And that's where, you know, trying to give them something else to keep them happy so that they can we can let the broccoli get big enough so it's not even affected by the birds could be helpful. But that's a good question to try to deal with in future research.
All right. And the next question, I think is just looking, this person is looking for clarifications. She wrote, weeds also add organic matter, deeper roots, and help fungi, etc. Correct, right?
Weeds definitely can add organic matter to the soil, if they're producing a lot of biomass. I'm not afraid of weeds in our systems as long as those weeds are not producing seed. The reason we don't want seed production by the weeds, though, is because that increases our weeding costs. So when you're trying to grow, lettuce or broccoli or whatever, hand weeding in an organic system is quite expensive. And so we want to be able to have as weed-free crops as we can, because otherwise those weeds can outcompete our crops and increase the weeding costs and make it far more challenging to produce. So I want vegetation in there, but I don't want vegetation that's challenging to manage.
Great. And I think we have time for a couple more questions. So if you don't want the mustard to spread, don't you need to prune flowers off of it before it seeds?
This mustard does not have the tendency to become a weed. And so it's different than some of the weedy mustards. This is, it's a cultivated variety. It's not an issue. It generally, we cut it back anyway right around when it produces flowers or even prior to that if we need to. So this one, it does not have a tendency to become a weed. So you don't want to, it's not just any mustard. You want to be careful which mustards you plant. This was white gold or Ida gold. Sinapis alba is the species.